Okay, so this discussion is going to look at training load and repetition. So this information goes hand in hand with some of the other kind of basic information and outlines as we do for some of the programming information that we're previously discussing. So one of the ways you could kind of quantify your work is just by kind of doing some basic math and measurements. So, this is some ways that you could kind of control volume and kind of measure what your athletes are doing. So mechanical work just strictly looks at force times displacement. So all you're literally looking at with that is with, for instance, with a lift, you're basically looking at how much weight is getting moved and you're multiplying it by how far it's getting moved. That's a measure of mechanical work. So if someone's bench pressing and they move 300 pounds, and again, this will vary based on the person, obviously, with arm length and the way they're built, but depending on how much they move that weight, that's how much mechanical work they've done. Probably a more useful way of monitoring how much is going on is just looking at load volume. So load volume looks at weight units times repetitions. So load volume is kind of a practical way of measuring the quantity of work performed. So say, for instance, if you have 100 units, you lifted it 2 times for 15 repetitions, that's going to give you 3,000 units. Okay, so that's what you're basically looking at when you look at load volume. So it's just the weight units times the number of repetitions that you lifted for. The arrangement of sets and reps affects the intensity value. So obviously we know that the heavier the weight is, you're going to do probably fewer repetitions with a heavier weight. So that looks at the intensity at which you're using it. But all in all here, this just kind of looks at some ways. Again, it's just giving you some ideas as far as how to kind of measure the actual work that your athletes are doing. So load and repetitions, I had talked about this, again, pretty basic. There's going to be an inverse relationship between the load and the amount of repetitions you do. The closer you are to your 1 repetition maximum, the fewer repetitions you're going to be able to perform with it. And again, we're usually going to assign things based on a percentage of a 1 repetition max or just even a repetition maximum. It's usually easier to do a percentage of a 1 repetition max, even if you estimate it. That's sometimes a better way to do to actually do that. So the 1 repetition max is the greatest amount of weight that can be lifted for 1 repetition. A repetition maximum is the most weight that can be lifted for a certain number of repetitions. Some people also like to use calculations. So what some people will do is take a repetition max and they'll plug it. There's equations that you can utilize that can kind of give you an estimated 1 repetition max. That's usually fine to do as long as the person's not doing a really high amount of reps. The higher the amount of reps they do in a lot of those equations, usually the result isn't quite as accurate when you do it. But those are kind of some of the different ways that you could kind of assign weights as the person goes throughout their program. So basically, this is just showing that inverse relationship. Okay, you don't necessarily have to memorize these numbers, but it gives you an idea. So for instance, if someone's working out at 85% of their 1 repetition maximum, usually that's going to allow approximately 6 repetitions. Again, it's an estimate. Some people do have a tendency to sometimes do a little bit more or less with these. It just kind of depends on the person. Like somebody, for instance, at 70% of their 1 rep max, they may be able to do 15 repetitions with it. So again, these numbers are an estimate, but it just kind of shows you that inverse relationship between the higher percentage of 1 rep and the volume we're actually going to do. So for testing the 1 repetition maximum, okay, again, if you're going to do 1 repetition max testing, it requires an adequate training status. So I would never recommend doing this with a beginner, but it certainly is, for the most part, pretty safe. Most people, believe it or not, people will say, well, I want to do a 3 RM or a 5 RM because I think it's safer. In my opinion, sometimes it's easier to get injured doing a 3 RM or a 5 RM because your form tends to break down when you're doing multiple rep max testing. Whereas with 1 rep max testing, as long as you have good spotters and everything in place, the person's just not going to be able to complete the lift. So again, you still though want to have someone with good technique. For instance, I would never test freshmen on 1 repetition max movements because I don't know what their technique is. And again, choose your core exercises for 1RM testing. Okay, so again, your squat, your deadlift, bench press, if you're going to do the Olympic lifts, those would be the things you would do your 1RM testing with. So testing procedure. So, and again, perform a number of preceding sets as a warm-up. So you do want to do some lighter sets. So this is kind of just basically what your textbook recommends. You know, start with 5 to 10 reps for approximately 2 to 3 sets, rest about a minute. Then as you start to go heavier and heavier, you want to gradually increase your rest time. And then, you know, as you're getting closer and closer, you want to, you know, start to take longer and longer rest intervals. So you kind of see the progression here. It doesn't have to be this, but this just gives you an idea as far as how to warm up. Okay, you don't want to do like one light warm-up set and then try to hit your 1 repetition max. You want to kind of do a little bit of a gradual buildup. You also want to mitigate fatigue. So again, the 5 to 10 rep sets, they're going to be pretty light because you don't want to fatigue yourself. You don't want to have accumulating fatigue as you're testing. If you're doing max effort strength work as a part of training, being a little fatigued is not as big of a deal, but for testing purposes, you don't want to do that. So estimating the 1 repetition max, again, you can predict it with a repetition max, kind of what I told you about before. There's 1 repetition max tables, again, that you can look at and see. Here's one of the prediction equations. I've used this one in the past. It's fairly accurate. You basically take the weight that they do, times it by the reps, multiply it by 0.0333. I have no idea where that number came from, but that's somebody good at statistics has found some way to incorporate that into the equation. You add the weight that they did, that gives you an estimated 1 rep max. All you have to know about equations such as this is that the higher the reps you go, the less accurate the equation tends to be. So in other words, say somebody does something, they do it for 12 reps, you know, 12, 15 reps or even more. If they try to plug that into this equation, it's not going to be as accurate, okay? So like I would say if you're going to use this, try to keep it below 8 reps to really kind of determine what it is you would do. It's going to make the equation a little bit more accurate. So if you're going to do multiple rep max testing, meaning that you're not going to do a 1 rep max, you're going to do something for multiple reps, you want to determine your goal repetitions. And again, if you're going to test assistance exercises, which I don't really recommend, I don't really think it's all that practical, you want to keep it above an 8 repetition maximum just for technique purposes. I don't recommend testing assistance exercises. I tend to not really see a benefit to that. You know, unless you're doing something maybe to quantify like hamstring strength, because people tend to be weak with that and just want to see some single joint stuff. But for the most part, you're not going to do that. If you are going to do it, keep it above an 8 repetition max. So training goals, again, you're going to utilize the information to base your training parameters. So when you're doing your testing, you're going to kind of determine, you know, what it is that you're looking at as far as, you know, what the person needs, whether it be upper body strength, lower body strength, whether max strength is a possible issue. And you're going to base your load and repetitions on testing. So again, this is all just information to give you data, okay, as far as how you want to kind of plan out your training for your athletes. So looking at the repetition maximum continuum, okay, so again, fewer repetitions, higher load, you're going to be doing that for strength and power. Again, these are kind of things that we've talked about at various other times. I don't really think this is a whole lot of new information. Fewer repetitions, higher load, more towards strength and power. Moderate to light loads, you're going to be accomplishing hypertrophy with that. Lighter loads or low intensity, you're looking more at muscle endurance. Again, it's all on a continuum. You will, for instance, even at very light loads at low intensity, you will develop some strength with that. Even doing the higher load stuff, the fewer repetitions, you'll experience some hypertrophy with that. So again, it exists on a continuum, but this is typically what you're looking to accomplish. And then we're going to be looking at the next couple slides at, you know, again, basic ideas as far as percentages and set rep schemes. So for your percentages, So the particular training load is going to enhance the outcome. So strength, you're looking at either greater than or equal to 85% for less than or equal to 6 reps. So you're keeping, again, the percentages higher, going lower with the reps. If you're looking at power, okay, there's different ways you could kind of associate mechanical power. There's single effort power in the 80 to 90% range for 1 to 2 reps for multiple efforts. 75 to 85% for 3 to 5 reps. That could also vary depending on whether you're using chains and bands as well, but that's basically if you're, approximately if you're using straight weight. Hypertrophy are in the 65 to 85% range for 6 to 12 reps, and muscular endurance less than 65% for greater than or equal to 12 reps. So that those, and again, percentages are going to be slightly different. You're going to, chances are you're going to read other articles and information, but they're all going to be kind of close. You'll see some slight variations in maybe the high end or the low end. I mean, we all kind of, for the most part, agree that if you're truly looking just at strength development and nervous system adaptation, you're going to be in the 85% range, and, and above to basically accomplish strength with that. So power training, again, you got to look at if you're doing single effort events or multiple efforts. So you can, again, look at the sets and reps on the previous slide. The percentage and rep scheme is obviously going to be applied a little differently. So again, we talk about how you're going to, for instance, the 3 to 5 reps between 75 and 85%. You could even go possibly lower than that and add volume, again, depending upon the exercise you're doing and the experience of the individual. And for power purposes, you don't want to load them maximally because you want a certain speed of movement, okay? So, we'll talk about kind of how you can modify that, in some other discussions later on this year. But, for the most part, you don't want to necessarily do a maximal load for power. Well, maximal loads, they help improving power, yes, but not directly. They work more for maximal strength. Load variation. So we talked a little bit about this with, with some of the different exercise variations and things like that. But you also want to vary intensity over the course of the training. It's going to decrease your chance of overtraining. So you can alter load so that only one day is heavy. I'm a big fan of doing the max effort and dynamic effort work. So one day you do your real heavy work. The next day you do lighter work. You just try to move it faster. Just try to decrease the load on the other days. And we talked about the rest between high CNS stressors. You want at least about 48 to 72 hours between high intensity efforts. Now, one thing people always talk about is progression. So individuals obviously eventually at some point have to start lifting weights that are heavier because, again, once you adapt to a load, if you don't continue to increase that, you're going to start to stagnate. So individuals will eventually adapt. Your textbook talks about the 2 for 2 rule. And again, none of these things are set in stone. They're just reference points. So what the 2 for 2 rule states is if an athlete can perform 2 or more reps on 2 consecutive workouts, you then increase the weight, okay? It's just one example. So what it does is it gives them a little bit more. Sometimes just increasing every workout might not pan out very well. If an individual has a bad day or something like that, it could possibly not work out and it could discourage the person. So sometimes getting 2 workouts in and seeing that increase over that could be a little bit better. As far as how much, it kind of depends how much you'll increase. It depends on your training status and the type of exercise, particularly for the upper body versus lower body. So upper body movements tend to increase a little bit slower than lower body movements just because the amount of muscle mass that you're using isn't quite as great. So you could kind of progress typically the lower body a little bit more, a little bit faster than you will with the upper body. And you'll see the same thing when you're warming up for max effort attempts. Typically your jumps with the lower body are going to be greater. So the 3 methods of improving muscular strength. So these are basically, this comes out of Zatsiorsky's book, Science and Practice of Strength Training. This is another way just to kind of couch your efforts. Maximal effort method is lifting maximal or near maximal loads for low number of repetitions, greater than or equal to 90% for 1 to 3 reps. Obviously, the benefit here is primarily increasing maximum strength. This is your high CNS stress, so the neurological changes here are great. The dynamic effort method, this is lifting a submaximal load as fast as possible. So again, I usually like to incorporate both of these methods within the week using conjugate style training. You have the real heavy day, and then you have the day that's lighter, but you still want to move the loads fast. So, you know, anywhere from 20 to 80%, that's a pretty big range. The reason being is there's various speeds throughout, so it just kind of depends on what your goals are. And usually a good way to do this, you know, we typically go, you know, with lighter weight, we always think high repetitions and low sets. With this, it's a little bit better to do low repetitions and do multiple sets. So getting good quality, fast reps in here. And for volume purposes, increasing the number of sets. So for instance, doing maybe 12 sets of 2 would be something you would do with the dynamic effort method. This way here, each one of the 2 reps are very crisp, and then they get more high quality repetitions into it. And then the repetition effort method, this is just your hypertrophy work. And again, it's a broad range, but again, some muscle groups actually respond to very high reps. That could be something we kind of talk about when we get into our discussions on your programs that you develop. So you see that I go up to 30 reps here with this. This kind of encompasses both hypertrophy and muscular endurance. And these are your learning outcomes. So this kind of ties in neatly with all the other information. Again, you use percentages as a guide, you know, and find different ways to just kind of monitor your athlete's work.